The lion should have been dead weeks ago. Alone, injured, without a pride or access to regular food, he had somehow defied every odd. His ribs showed like rails beneath his torn coat. A deep wound ran along his hind leg, crusted at the edges but still raw in places. No one knew exactly how long he had been wandering, but his tracks, spotted first near the boundary of the reserve, had shown signs of looping confusion and struggle. David was the first to spot him clearly. He had seen injured lions before, but something about this one stopped him. There was no roar, no fearsome growl. The lion didn't even flinch when David's team came into view from a distance. He just stood there, panting, his legs trembling beneath him. His eyes held something that shook David more than the sight of the wounds, an exhaustion so deep it looked hollow. And yet he was still standing. They watched him for hours that first day, not moving closer, not speaking above a whisper. Most lions would have collapsed by now or succumbed to infection or hunger. But this one hadn't given up. He stayed on his feet, swaying at times, pausing only to rest against the base of a fallen tree before moving again. No other animals approached him. Even the scavengers had begun to keep their distance, as though sensing there was something unnatural about the way he clung to life. David turned to his team quietly and said, "We're not walking away from this." It went against the rules. Intervention with wild predators wasn't taken lightly. Nature had its own laws, and rangers weren't meant to disrupt the balance unless absolutely necessary. But David wasn't looking at a case study. He was looking at a creature that had refused to die, not because survival was easy, but because something in him wouldn't allow surrender. Later that evening, David filed the report with one line added in bold. "Injured male lion, alive, alone, still walking." No one said much at first, but something about that final sentence, the fact that he was still walking, sparked a ripple through the reserve staff. They'd seen animals fight before, but this wasn't just survival, it was a statement. David stared at the report long after it was sent and whispered to himself, "He's still fighting. So we will too." The next morning, David returned alone. He didn't need backup. He wasn't there to intervene, not yet. He just wanted to see if the lion had made it through the night. A part of him expected to find a body, the kind of stillness that says everything without sound. But when he reached the ridge and looked down across the clearing, the lion was there, barely, but there. He was lying on his side, motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His eyes were half closed, but not empty. They followed David from a distance. No growl, no attempt to flee, just a flicker of awareness. Like the lion knew he was being watched and chose not to care. David sat down in the dirt, pulled out his notepad, and started to sketch the lion's outline. He noted the position of the injury, the unnatural angle of the back leg, the swelling near the shoulder. But what struck him most was what wasn't there. No blood trail, no signs of feeding, no tracks from another lion. Whatever pride he once had was gone. Either they left him behind after a fight or he was driven out. Either way, he had been alone for some time. Lions didn't survive like this, not for long. They were social animals, bound by territory, by order. A lone male, especially one injured, was not supposed to last more than a few days. And yet here he was, alive, still watching. David remembered a pride sighting reported weeks earlier, not far from this area. A skirmish had broken out between rival males. No one knew what happened to the losing side. No one followed up. Most wouldn't have. But David looked at this lion now and wondered if he had been one of them, the ones no one expected to come back. He radioed the main station and kept it short. "Lion is still alive, still alone, awaiting guidance." The response was quick, protocol-driven. Observe only. No interference unless immediate threat to public or livestock. He expected it, but it didn't sit right with him. He looked back at the lion. The eyes were still on him. And there was something there, something beyond pain or fear. It was tired, yes, but it hadn't quit. David stood, his voice low but steady. "You're not just trying to stay alive, are you?" The lion didn't move, didn't blink, but the look held. And for David, that was enough. He turned and walked back slowly, heart tight, already planning what he'd do next. He didn't know how yet, but he wasn't going to let that lion die alone. Not while he still had fight in him. By the next day, David had made up his mind. The lion wasn't going to last much longer without help, but a full sedation and relocation could break him. The risk was too high. His body was too fragile. Fear could push him into running, and one wrong step on that leg could be the end. David didn't want to save him by force. He wanted the lion to choose survival on his own terms. If they were going to help, they had to do it differently. He proposed a new plan to the small team at the outpost. No cages, no tranquilizers. They would track him quietly, day by day, leaving food and clean water nearby, never close enough to scare him, but not so far he couldn't find it. If he ate, they'd begin adding antibiotics into the meat, careful with the dosage, easing him toward healing without confrontation. Most of the team hesitated. It wasn't standard procedure, it wasn't certain, but David's voice didn't shake when he said, "If he trusts us enough to stay near, we owe him a chance." They agreed. That evening, they returned to where the lion had last been seen. He was still there, lying in the same dry patch, though now his head was lifted, watching as the sun began to fall. David stayed at a distance while the others placed a hunk of meat on a flat rock 30 feet from the lion. No movement. Not at first. Then, after 10 long minutes, the lion shifted. He stood slowly, his front leg steady, his back leg trailing like dead weight. He moved toward the meat, one labored step at a time. David didn't breathe. When the lion reached it, he sniffed, then lay down beside it, pulling it toward him with his paw. He ate. David turned away for a moment and let his eyes close. It was the smallest victory, but it felt enormous. The lion, still unnamed, had accepted something from them, not out of desperation alone, but because he still wanted to live. That night, David sat outside the outpost, staring up at the stars. He thought about how many animals he'd seen come and go over the years, how many injuries turned into statistics, how many stories were never finished. This one wouldn't be one of them. He didn't care if it took days or weeks. He'd follow the lion until it ended. He only hoped it ended with the lion still walking. And for the first time, he called him by a name. "Quito," he whispered to himself. Hope. It felt right. It felt earned. Quito returned to the same spot the next evening. His steps were slow, but more certain. The swelling on his leg still made his movements stiff, but he was upright, alert, and watching. David remained hidden behind the brush, binoculars steady in his hands, barely breathing as he observed. Each time Quito ate, David marked it as a step forward. The food was now laced with a small, carefully measured dose of antibiotics. If it worked, the infection would ease before it took hold of his bloodstream. There was no backup plan. This had to work. The third day, something shifted. Quito didn't wait for the food to be dropped and the team to back away. He stood, watching as David's colleague Nina walked the same careful path toward the stone. She laid down the meat, turned, and began to retreat as always. But before she reached the usual safe distance, Quito started limping toward the offering. No growl, no aggression. Just a quiet decision to close the gap. Nina froze. David whispered calmly into the radio, telling her to stay still. Quito passed within 15 feet of her, his eyes never leaving hers. He walked right past her to the meat, pulled it close, and began to eat. When he was done, he didn't retreat. He lay down near the same rock, chest heaving gently, and rested his head on his paws. Not defeated, just tired. Later that night, David sat beside Nina by the fire. She didn't say much, just stared into the flames and finally muttered, "He looked at me like he already knew I wasn't there to hurt him." David nodded slowly. It was what he had started to believe too, that somehow Quito recognized something in them. Maybe it was their patience. Maybe it was the way they never forced their presence, never came too close, never demanded trust. They just gave him space and offered help again and again until he accepted it. By the end of the week, Quito was eating every meal. His eyes were brighter. The wound on his leg looked less angry, less swollen. He still didn't walk far, but he no longer dragged himself like he had before. He sat up more often, watched the horizon, swatted at flies with slow flicks of his tail. These were ordinary things, but in David's eyes they were signs of life coming back. He began speaking to Quito every time he visited. Nothing dramatic, just quiet words, half to the lion, half to himself. One evening, as the sky turned gold, David stepped a little closer. Quito didn't move. He just lifted his head and looked at him, calm and unblinking. David's voice cracked as he said, "You're not alone anymore." And in that moment he knew the lion understood. Maybe not the words, but the kindness behind them. 2 days passed, then 3, and Quito didn't show up. David returned to the clearing each morning, and again at dusk. Food left in the usual place, water carefully poured into the stone basin they had dug, but the meat went untouched. The water remained still. The brush around the clearing didn't bear his tracks. David's chest tightened a little more with each empty visit. Quito hadn't just disappeared. He had vanished in the kind of silence that said something was wrong. By the 5th day, David's worry outweighed the protocol. He scanned the perimeter looking for signs. Broken grass, blood, anything. He walked slow, careful not to disturb the subtle clues of the land. Then he found it. Drag marks. Uneven paw prints leading away from the clearing and into the dry ravine to the north. The path was scattered with signs of struggle. Tufts of fur. A streak of red against a rock. Not fresh, but not yet forgotten by the sun. He followed the trail down into the hollow and spotted movement near the base of a boulder. 2 hyenas scurried away at the sound of his footsteps, ears back, muzzles stained. David's heart kicked hard against his ribs as he rushed forward, hand instinctively reaching for the radio he never used. He didn't call it in. Not yet. Quito lay behind the rock, breathing shallow, his side torn where fresh wounds stretched across healing ones. His eyes opened at David's approach. There was no panic in them, only pain, and something else, recognition. David dropped to his knees beside him. He didn't speak right away, he just looked. At the new wounds, at the weakness in Quito's muscles, at the sheer effort it must have taken just to stay alive. His voice finally came, low and tight. "You fought them, didn't you? You didn't run." Quito blinked slowly, as if to answer. David reached for the sat phone and called the reserve. "He's hurt again, bad, but he's alive. I need the med team now, we're out of time." Back at camp, there had always been a debate about what animals knew. Whether they understood kindness, whether they remembered the ones who stood beside them. But when David laid the last piece of meat near Quito's paw, and the lion, bloody, shaking, still tried to pull it close with one last flick of effort, he knew the answer. Trust wasn't just built. It was earned through pain, through time, through presence. And Quito, even in his worst moment, hadn't walked away from it. David stayed with him until the team arrived. As they loaded the lion onto a stretcher, his head lolled toward David once more. Not pleading, not afraid, just watching, like always. David whispered, "We're not done yet." And Quito didn't look away. Quito didn't fight the sedation. As the injection settled into his veins, he rested his head without resistance, eyes closing slowly like he was finally giving himself permission to stop holding it all together. The vet team worked quickly, lifting his frail, bloodied body onto the truck bed lined with thick blankets and soft restraints. David rode in the back with him, one hand resting gently on Quito's shoulder, as if trying to keep his heartbeat steady through touch alone. He didn't speak. Words felt too small for what was happening. Back at the field clinic, the air was thick with urgency but calm. The team moved like clockwork, each of them focused, quiet, deliberate. They shaved around the new wounds, cleaned the gashes where hyena teeth had torn through fragile skin, flushed the infection that had tried to take hold again. Antibiotics, fluids, sutures. It wasn't just one injury anymore. It was the weight of all the days Quito had survived on sheer instinct. His body was collapsing under the toll. David stayed through the procedure, leaning against the wall with clenched fists and tired eyes. At one point, he almost looked away. But then Quito stirred under the anesthesia, his paws twitching lightly, as if even unconscious he was still fighting. David stepped closer and whispered, "I see you. You're safe now." Hours passed. When the team finished, they laid Quito under a shaded awning in the recovery pen, his body draped with damp cloths to keep his temperature down. The worst was over, but the next few days would be delicate. He would either fight his way back again or slowly drift away. David sat on the other side of the gate, legs crossed, watching him breathe. In, outside, in, outside. Each rise of the lion's chest was a small miracle. For the first time since Quito had appeared in the clearing, David let himself feel the weight of it. The near misses, the nights of waiting, the broken rules, the hope that refused to quit. He had seen animals survive terrible things before, but this was different. Quito hadn't just survived, he had chosen to trust. And that trust had changed something in all of them. 2 days later, Quito opened his eyes, slowly, blinking into the light. He didn't try to stand, he didn't need to. He looked toward the gate where David sat, motionless, and held his gaze. There was no fear, no confusion, just something solid, familiar. David smiled, too exhausted to say much. "You're back," he whispered. And Quito blinked again, then let his head rest on the earth, not from defeat but from peace. Quito healed slowly, but he healed. Each day he stood a little longer, walked a little farther, held his head a little higher. The wounds on his body faded, but the depth in his eyes remained. The kind that only comes from surviving what should have ended you. David visited every day not because it was his job, but because it no longer felt right to stay away. He didn't bring food anymore. Quito didn't need coaxing. He brought presence. He brought calm. And every time Quito looked his way, something in David settled. When the day finally came to release him, the team gathered at the edge of the protected zone. The gate was opened, and Quito stepped into the open land with the quiet confidence of something reclaimed, not something tamed. He didn't look back at first. He just walked, one slow step at a time, each muscle moving with purpose. But when he reached the ridge, he paused. David stood behind the fence, his hands resting on the post, watching like he had so many times before. Quito turned, met his gaze across the distance, and for one brief second, the silence between them was filled with something enormous. It wasn't goodbye. It was recognition. Quito walked on into the gold of the wild. The lion who shouldn't have made it a week had made it through a month, and then more. He hadn't just survived the wilderness. He had survived loneliness, infection, hunger, fear. And he had done it with the help of something rare. Not science, not strength. Kindness. Photos of his journey spread across the globe. Children drew him. Letters came from strangers. People wrote to say that if he could make it through everything, Maybe they could too. David read one letter out loud to the team. I was going to give up, but then I read about the lion. Thank you for not walking away. David kept a small photo on his desk, Quito lying under the tree in the recovery pen, eyes half closed, safe. Some stories fade after the ending. This one didn't. It planted something in the hearts of everyone it touched. If this story moved you, carry it forward, not just for the lion, but for every living thing still fighting to be seen, to be believed in, to be saved. Kindness isn't loud, it's not always easy, but it is always powerful. Subscribe to our channel for more true, unforgettable stories like Quito's. Stories that prove survival begins not with strength, but with the decision to care. Be the reason someone holds on. Be someone's quiet miracle. Subscribe now and help us keep telling stories that matter.